Circuit City fired its best-paid employees to save money, and 2 years later, the entire company collapsed. That sentence sounds almost too clean to be true, like a fable someone made up after the fact to teach a lesson. But it is not a fable. It is a documented decision made by real executives at a real electronics retailer, and it is still studied today as one of the clearest examples of a cost cut that quietly destroyed the thing it was supposed to protect. Here is what actually happened. In 2007, Circuit City laid off around 3,400 store employees. That was roughly 8% of its entire sales staff, which is not a small trim around the edges. It is a meaningful chunk of the people who stood on the floor every day talking to customers. And crucially, the company was not targeting its worst performers. It was not weeding out the people who showed up late, or the ones customers complained about, or the ones who could not hit basic sales numbers. It specifically targeted workers who were earning above market rate for their role. In plain terms, that means the people who had been there long enough, or were skilled enough, to have worked their way up to higher pay within their job title. Think about what that actually selects for. In most retail jobs, pay rises with tenure and performance. The employee who has been on the floor for 3 or 4 years, who knows the store inside out, who has sold enough units to earn raises along the way, is exactly the kind of person this policy was built to remove. Circuit City was not cutting cost centers. It was cutting its own experience curve on purpose, because experience is what shows up as a bigger number on a payroll spreadsheet. It helps to picture this the way you would picture a sports team managing a salary cap. Every team has a fixed budget, and every general manager occasionally has to let a veteran player go, because a rookie can do a similar job for a fraction of the cost. Sometimes that trade works out fine, because the veteran really had declined and the rookie really was ready. But every fan of every sport also remembers the trades that gutted a team's chemistry, where the front office cut the exact players who held the locker room together, the ones who made everyone else better in ways that never showed up in a single stat line. A payroll department doing this across thousands of retail stores is making that same kind of trade thousands of times over, based purely on salary, with no equivalent of a coach in the room to say this particular veteran is worth keeping. There is also a selection effect working against the company here, and it is worth naming directly. When you specifically target your highest paid, most experienced workers and tell them to reapply at a discount, you are not choosing which of them leaves. They are. The ones with the strongest resumes, the ones most confident they can find comparable work elsewhere, are exactly the ones least likely to wait around and reapply for a pay cut. The employees most likely to accept the new terms are often the ones with fewer other options, not necessarily the ones who were most valuable on the floor. So the policy does not just remove experience at random, it tends to filter out the most employable, most in-demand people first, which is close to the opposite of what a company wants if it is trying to protect its best talent. And the company did not stop at firing them. It invited many of these same employees to reapply for their own jobs, at lower pay, after a short waiting period. Picture what that actually asks of a person. You show up, you build real skill at your job, you get promoted or given raises for doing it well, and then you are told your paycheck itself is the problem. You can have your old desk back, doing the same work, for less money, if you are willing to wait a few weeks and reapply like a stranger. Some employees surely did come back under those terms. Many others did not, and took their knowledge somewhere else, sometimes straight to a competitor. Publicly, Circuit City framed all of this as a straightforward cost-cutting measure meant to boost margins. That framing makes sense on a quarterly earnings call. Payroll is one of the largest controllable expenses a retailer has, and if you can lower average wage per employee across thousands of stores, the math on a spreadsheet looks immediately better. Executives can point to the projected savings and call it discipline. The story sounds responsible, even boring, which is usually exactly how bad decisions get past a boardroom. Analysts and former employees told a very different story afterward, once the results started showing up in stores rather than in projections. Customers noticed a sharp drop in knowledgeable sales help almost immediately. This is worth sitting with, because it is the actual mechanism connecting the layoff to the collapse A customer walks into an electronics store to buy something they do not fully understand. Maybe it is a television, maybe it is a computer, maybe it is a car stereo. They are relying on a salesperson to explain the differences, to steer them away from the wrong purchase, and to make them feel like the store knows more than they do. That trust is the entire value proposition of a physical electronics retailer, especially once online shopping started giving customers a lower price alternative. Take away the knowledgeable staff, and you take away the one advantage a store has over a warehouse full of boxes. This happened at the worst possible moment for Circuit City because it was competing directly against Best Buy, and Best Buy had invested heavily in staff training around that same period. So while Circuit City was replacing seasoned salespeople with cheaper, less experienced new hires, its main rival was moving in the opposite direction, deliberately building up staff knowledge as a competitive advantage. Customers standing in one store got confident, informed help. Customers standing in the other store increasingly did not. Over time, shoppers vote with their feet, and 8% of a workforce being swapped out for cheaper labor is more than enough to shift that experience for a large share of customers. There is a second, quieter cost that a payroll spreadsheet never captures either, which is the cost of the transition itself. Every new hire, no matter how promising, needs weeks or months to reach the productivity of the person they replaced. During that ramp-up period, they make more mistakes, they take longer to help each customer, and they are more likely to lose a sale to hesitation or to give an answer that is technically true but not actually helpful. Multiply that across a few thousand new employees, replacing a few thousand experienced ones, at the same time, in the middle of a competitive market, and you get a company that is simultaneously paying to rebuild the exact capability it just paid to remove. None of that shows up as a line item labeled training drag. It shows up months later as declining sales, by which point it is very hard to trace the decline back to a single decision made in a boardroom. The employees who were let go were not generic labor that could be swapped in and out without consequence. They understood inventory quirks, the kind of thing that never shows up in a manual, like which model tends to have stock issues, or which accessory customers always forget to ask about. They understood customer preferences built up from hundreds of real conversations on the floor. They understood product details deeply enough to compare options honestly instead of just reading a spec sheet out loud. None of that is written down anywhere central. It lives in the people who do the job every day, and once those people leave, the knowledge leaves with them. The employees who replaced them were cheaper on paper and less trained in practice, and the gap between those two things is exactly where the customer experience quietly eroded. It is worth pausing on why this kind of knowledge is so easy for a company to underestimate. A finance team looking at payroll sees a name, a job title, and an hourly wage. It does not see the years of small judgment calls that employee has learned to make instantly, the kind of thing an experienced person does without even noticing they are doing it. That invisible skill is sometimes called tacit knowledge, the know-how people carry in their heads and hands rather than in a written procedure. The philosopher Michael Polanyi, who is generally credited with naming this idea, put it simply: we know more than we can tell. A skilled employee cannot fully write down everything they know, because a lot of it is pattern recognition built from repetition, not a checklist that fits in a manual. It is genuinely difficult to put a dollar figure on tacit knowledge, which means it is also genuinely easy to cut it without anyone officially deciding to cut it. Nobody wrote a memo that said reduce customer trust. They wrote a memo that said reduce payroll above a certain threshold, and the loss of trust and knowledge was simply a side effect nobody put a number on. But here is the part nobody expects going in. This is exactly why cost-cutting decisions like this one tend to look fine in the room where they are made. Everyone in that room is looking at a spreadsheet full of names, titles, and hourly rates, and the spreadsheet cannot show what is missing. It cannot show the employee who remembers a regular customer's past purchases and tailors a recommendation around them. It cannot show the employee who quietly fixes a supplier mix-up before it ever reaches a customer complaint. It cannot show the manager who trusts a specific salesperson enough to hand them the most difficult customer of the day. All of that is real value, and all of it is invisible to the tool being used to make the decision. A decision-making process will always be blind to whatever its inputs cannot measure, And payroll is a very narrow input for a question this important. Sales continued sliding in the years that followed the layoffs. This was not an isolated bad quarter. It was a sustained decline, the kind that suggests something structural had changed rather than something temporary. Circuit City filed for bankruptcy in 2008, roughly a year after the layoffs, and by 2009, the company had liquidated entirely, closing every remaining store and selling off its assets. A company that had once been one of the largest electronics retailers in the country ceased to exist within about 2 years of a decision that was supposed to make it healthier. It is worth being honest about the fact that no single decision ever sinks a company entirely on its own. Circuit City was operating in a difficult retail environment, competing against a well-run rival during a period when consumer electronics pricing was under pressure from every direction. A single layoff, on its own, rarely explains an entire bankruptcy. But that is actually what makes this case so useful to study, rather than less useful. The layoff did not need to be the only cause of the collapse. It only needed to remove the one advantage that might have let the company hold its ground while everything else was working against it. Take away a company's edge right as its environment gets harder, and you do not need a single dramatic mistake to explain the fall. You just need one decision that quietly disarmed the company at the exact moment it needed every advantage it had. Now here is the part most people miss when they hear this story told quickly. It would be easy to walk away thinking the lesson is simply never fire anyone for cost reasons, but that is not actually what the evidence supports, and it is not a useful takeaway for anyone running a real business with real budget constraints. Every company has to review labor cost at some point. Payroll genuinely can grow faster than revenue, and ignoring that is its own kind of mismanagement. The mistake at Circuit City was not that leadership looked at cost. The mistake was the specific filter they used to decide who to cut. Here is a sharper way to say what actually went wrong, and this is worth sitting with rather than rushing past. Circuit City did not fail because it tried to control costs. It failed because it let a spreadsheet make a judgment call that required actual judgment. Sorting employees by salary line is easy. It takes an afternoon and a formula. Sorting employees by how much irreplaceable knowledge they carry takes real management effort, actual conversations with store managers, actual attention to who quietly makes a location run well. Circuit City chose the version that was easy to execute over the version that was accurate, and the market punished the difference within 2 years. This is a trap that is easy to fall into in any organization, not just a giant retail chain. A spreadsheet is seductive precisely because it gives you a defensible answer fast. You can sort a list by salary in seconds and present a tidy recommendation to leadership by the end of the day. Actually knowing who carries irreplaceable knowledge requires talking to store managers, watching how work actually gets done, and trusting judgment that cannot be fully justified with a single column of numbers. That is slower, messier, and harder to defend in a meeting if someone challenges it. But the slower process is the one that protects the business, and the fast process is the one that quietly dismantles it while looking perfectly reasonable on the way there. Business researchers have referenced this decision repeatedly since then, using it as a case study in exactly this pattern: short-term cost-cutting that damages long-term capability. It gets taught because it is unusually clean, as an example. There is a clear decision, a clear mechanism connecting that decision to declining performance, and a clear outcome. Most business failures are messy, with a dozen contributing factors tangled together. This one has a straight, traceable line from a single policy to a company's collapse, which is exactly why it keeps getting cited years later. Follow for more management theories explained simply. So what is the actual, practical lesson here? The one a manager can use instead of just nodding along to a cautionary tale. It is not that experienced staff should never be reviewed for cost. Reviewing cost is a normal, healthy part of running any business, and pretending otherwise would be naive. The real lesson is that experience and institutional knowledge carry real value that does not show up cleanly on a spreadsheet. That value is completely real. It drives sales, it retains customers, and it protects a company's reputation. But it is invisible to a tool that only reads wage numbers. Cutting people purely by salary line, without asking what else they carry, can quietly gut the exact advantage a company depends on to compete. And by the time that shows up in the results, the damage is already done, and the people who could have explained why are already gone. Before a cost cut targets tenure or pay level, map what specific knowledge walks out the door with each person, not just what it saves on paper. That single step, actually asking what each experienced employee knows that a replacement would not, is the difference between disciplined cost management and the kind of decision that looks smart in a spreadsheet and looks like Circuit City 2 years later.